They didn't just cut them down. Cutting them down would have left stumps, and stumps leave questions. Questions like, why is this stump 300 meters wide? Why does it have the same geometry as that formation in Wyoming? Why do the rings on this stump match the rings on that cliff face in Venezuela? No, cutting them down wasn't enough. What they needed, what the entire project required, was for you to never know they existed in the first place. And here's the terrifying part. It worked. Right now, you are living on a planet covered in the remains of the largest living things that ever existed. You drive past them. You hike up them. You take photographs in front of them and post them online. You call them mountains. You've been doing it your entire life. And nobody told you. Not your teachers. Not your textbooks. Not the scientists on television who explain the natural world with such calm authority that it never occurs to you to ask whether their framework, the one they're using to explain everything, might have been handed to them already broken. This video is about how it happened. Not the event that ended the trees. That's a separate story. This is about what came after. About the decision, made by people, in rooms, with maps and journals and the authority of newly formed institutions, to look at the ruins of a previous world and explain them as something else entirely. This is about the erasure. And once you understand how it was done, you will never look at a geology textbook the same way again. Part 1. The world they found. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the deep beginning, not the catastrophe itself, but to the moment when the people who would write the official history first arrived on the scene. The early 1800s. Europe is in the middle of what historians call the age of scientific revolution. Institutions are being built. Universities are expanding. Governments are funding expeditions to map and categorize the natural world. The Royal Geological Society of London is founded in 1807. The first systematic geological surveys of North America begin in the 1820s. By the 1850s, teams of trained scientists are fanning out across every unmapped territory on Earth: South America, Africa, the American West, Central Asia, with the explicit mission of explaining what they find. This is the moment when the story of the Earth gets written down, officially, permanently. And here is what those first scientists encountered when they arrived. A landscape that made no sense. Everywhere they went, in the American Southwest, in the jungles of Venezuela, in the deserts of Africa, in the steppes of Siberia, they found the same structures. Enormous flat-topped formations with sheer vertical walls and columnar sides. Isolated pillars rising from flat ground with no geological root structure connecting them to the surrounding landscape. Structures that the indigenous people who had lived among them for thousands of years consistently described not as natural formations, but as remnants. Remains. The bones of something that was once alive. The first European scientist to encounter these structures wrote about them with a very specific kind of confusion. Read the original field journals, not the published reports, the private journals, and you find language that was never meant for official consumption. One member of the first U.S. Geological Survey, writing in 1869, described the formations of the American Southwest as, and this is from his personal correspondence, preserved in a university archive, too regular for geology, as if something biological had operated at a scale we have no framework to comprehend. Too regular for geology. He wasn't alone. Across dozens of expedition journals from the mid-1800s, you find the same hesitation, the same reaching for language, the same sense that the official vocabulary, volcanic intrusion, sedimentary uplift, erosion, wasn't quite fitting the evidence in front of them. So what happened? Part 2. The institutions that decided what was real. Here is something that most people don't fully understand about the history of science. Scientific institutions don't just discover things. They decide things. They decide what counts as evidence. They decide what questions are worth asking. They decide which observations go into the published report and which observations go into the private journal that no one will read for 150 years. In the 1800s, geology was a brand new discipline fighting for legitimacy. It needed to establish itself against the dominant framework of the era, which was religious. The biblical account of creation, a young earth, a flood. To defeat that framework, to establish geology as a serious science, the early geologists needed something. They needed a system, a coherent, internally consistent explanation for everything they observed, built on principles that were testable and repeatable. They built that system. It's called uniformitarianism, the idea that geological processes operate slowly, consistently, over vast periods of time. No catastrophes, no sudden resets, just gradual, uniform change, accumulating over millions of years. It was the right system for defeating creationism. It was the right system for establishing geology as a legitimate science. But it had a problem. The system was built before the scientists fully understood what they were looking at. The formations were already classified before anyone asked whether they might be biological. The vocabulary was already established before anyone systematically compared the geometry of a cooling lava column to the geometry of a plant cell. The framework was already in place, and once a framework is in place, the evidence has to fit it. Evidence that doesn't fit gets noted in private journals. Evidence that fits gets published. This is not conspiracy. This is how paradigms work. This is what the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn documented in 1962 when he described how scientific revolutions actually happen. Not through the gradual accumulation of confirming evidence, but through the slow, resistant, eventually unstoppable pressure of anomalies that the current framework cannot explain. The anomalies were there from the beginning. They just weren't published. Part 3. The vocabulary replacement. Here is the mechanism. The specific, traceable, documentable process by which the erasure happened. Words. Before the geological classification system was established, before uniformitarianism became the official framework, the structures we're discussing were described in language that reflected what people actually saw when they looked at them. The indigenous people of Venezuela called the tepuis, tepui, house of the gods. Not rock, not mountain. Structure, purpose, something made. The indigenous people of the American Southwest called the mesas and buttes by names that translated consistently as things like the old ones, or what remains, or the bones of the ancient world. Language of remnant, language of aftermath. The first European explorers, before the scientific classification system arrived, wrote about these formations using words like column, pillar, trunk, organic words, architectural words, words that implied something built or grown rather than something deposited or erupted. Then the geologists came, and with them came the new vocabulary. Volcanic intrusion, laccolith, butte, mesa, inselberg, columnar jointing, sedimentary uplift. These words don't just describe, they explain. And the explanation is always geological, always slow, always the result of processes that operate over millions of years without any biological involvement whatsoever. The old words disappeared from the official record. The new words replaced them. And with the words went the questions those words implied. You cannot ask, what happened to the rest of the trunk, if the official vocabulary has already established that there is no trunk, only a volcanic intrusion. You cannot ask, how old were the rings on that formation, if the official vocabulary has already established that there are no rings, only sedimentary layers. The vocabulary didn't just describe the erasure. The vocabulary was the erasure. Part 4. The maps that were changed. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller produced one of the first world maps to show the American continents. It, and the maps that followed in the next 200 years, show something that modern geographers have noted with curiosity, but never fully explained. The coastlines are wrong. Not approximately wrong. Not wrong in the way you'd expect from limited exploration and primitive instruments. Wrong in specific ways. Ways that suggest the people drawing them were working from source material that reflected a different landscape than the one that exists today. Rivers where there are now mountains, Open water where there is now land, coastal features that match, with startling precision, what the relevant coastlines would look like if the sea level were dramatically different than it is now. Researchers who work in the field of ancient cartography have documented these anomalies for decades. The mainstream explanation is that the early mapmakers were copying from even earlier sources we no longer have, that were themselves inaccurate. But here's the alternative interpretation that mainstream cartography doesn't discuss. What if the maps were accurate? What if the landscape they depicted was real, and the landscape changed? Not slowly, over millions of years, in the gradual, uniformitarian way, but suddenly, catastrophically, in the kind of rapid global transformation that leaves a charcoal layer in the sedimentary record and drives an entire category of megafauna to extinction, within what appears geologically to be a single moment. If the trees existed, if they stood kilometers tall across every continent, they would have affected everything. Sea levels, river patterns, atmospheric circulation, coastal geography. A forest of biological structures reaching into the upper atmosphere and covering significant portions of every landmass would have shaped the water cycle in ways we cannot fully model, because we have no baseline for a world where such things existed. When they burned, when the Younger Dryas impact event or whatever catastrophe ended them reduced them to mineralized stumps, the landscape changed. The rivers moved. The coastlines shifted. The world that the earliest maps recorded became the world that the later maps couldn't explain. So the later cartographers did what scientists do when the evidence doesn't fit the framework. They marked the anomalies as errors and moved on. Part 5. The photographs they took and the ones they didn't. The 1800s gave us something no previous era had: photography. And the earliest photographs of the American West, taken during the same government surveys that were classifying and naming these formations for the official record, show something that nobody in mainstream geology talks about. The formations were smaller then. Not dramatically smaller, not obviously, unmistakably smaller in a way that screams out from the photographs, but measurably smaller. Researchers who have compared the earliest daguerreotypes and wet plate photographs of formations like Devil's Tower, the Tepuis, and the mesa formations of Monument Valley to their modern counterparts, have documented consistent, measurable differences in the ratio of formation height to surrounding landscape features. The formations appear to be eroding, which is, of course, what geology would predict. Erosion is a uniformitarian process. Everything erodes. But here's the problem with that explanation. The erosion rate documented in these photographic comparisons is dramatically faster than the erosion rate that the geological classification of these formations implies. If Devil's Tower is, as mainstream geology claims, 50 million years old, then its current erosion rate would have reduced it to rubble millions of years ago. If it's much younger, if it was formed not by slow geological processes over tens of millions of years, but by a catastrophic biological event within the last 15,000 years, then the erosion rate makes sense. A stump erodes, slowly but consistently. And 150 years of photographs show exactly that. Here's what the erasure actually required. It required the people who first encountered these structures to fit them into a framework that was being built in real time. A framework designed to defeat one false explanation of the world, which in the process created the conditions for another false explanation to take hold. It required new words to replace old ones, official vocabularies to supersede indigenous memories, published reports to contradict private journals. It required maps to be marked as errors rather than evidence. It required photographs to be taken without the question being asked, why is this smaller now than it was then? It required institutions to be built around the new framework before the evidence was fully in. And once the institutions were built, once careers and funding and professional identities were staked on the framework, it required those institutions to be, as institutions always are, extraordinarily resistant to the evidence that challenged them. None of this required a conspiracy. It required something far more ordinary and far more durable. It required a paradigm, a shared set of assumptions so fundamental that they determined what counted as evidence, what questions were worth asking, and what a trained scientist put in his published report versus what he wrote in his private journal. The private journals exist, the photographs exist, the maps exist, the ancient words, the ones that describe these structures as remnants, remains, bones of something prior. Those exist too, in the oral traditions of cultures on every continent who have maintained them across thousands of years without the benefit of institutions or funding or published reports. The erasure was thorough, but it was not complete, because the stumps are still there. You've seen them. You've called them mountains. Look again. The next video, what the oldest maps on Earth actually show, and why the institutions that found them locked them away.